Welcome to episode 123 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue in Epicurus' letter to Herodotus, and we address some continuing difficult material about properties and qualities of atoms and bodies and the void. We also address questions about the nature of time. I need to apologize before we get started that the audio quality this week is not up to our normal standards. Hopefully we'll have that fixed next week. In the meantime, let's now join today's discussion with Martin reading the text.
All these properties have their own peculiar means of being perceived and distinguished, provided always that the aggregate body goes along with them and is never wrested from them, but in virtue of its comprehension as an aggregate of qualities acquires the predicate of body. Furthermore, they often happen to bodies and yet do not permanently accompany them accidents, of which we must suppose neither that they do not exist at all, nor that they have the nature of a whole body, nor that they can be classed among unseen things, nor as incorporeal. So that when, according to the most general usage, we employ this name, we make clear that accidents have neither the nature of the whole, which we comprehend in its aggregate and call body, nor that of the qualities which permanently accompany it, without which a given body cannot be conceived. But as the result of certain acts of apprehension, provided the aggregate body goes along with them, they might each be given this name, but only on occasions when each one of them is seen to occur, since accidents are not permanent accompaniments. And we must not banish this clear vision from the realm of existence, because it does not possess the nature of the whole to which it is joined, nor that of the permanent accompaniments, nor must we suppose that such contingencies exist independently, for this is inconceivable both with regard to them and to the permanent properties. But just as it appears in sensation, we must think of them all as accidents occurring to bodies, and that not as permanent accompaniments, or again as having in themselves a place in the ranks of material existence. Rather, they are seen to be just what our actual sensation shows their proper character to be. Moreover, you must firmly grasp this point as well. We must not look for the time, as we do for all other things which we look for in an object, by referring them to the general conceptions which we perceive in our own minds. But we must take the direct intuition in accordance with which we speak of a long time or short time, and examine it, applying our intuition to time as we do to other things. Neither must we search for expressions as likely to be better, but employ just those which are in common use about it. Nor again must we predicate of time anything else as having the same essential nature as this special perception, as some people do, but we must turn our thoughts particularly to that only with which we associate this peculiar perception and by which we measure it. For indeed this requires no demonstration, but only reflection, to show that it is with days and nights and their divisions that we associate it, and likewise also with internal feelings or absence of feeling, and with movements and states of rest. In connection with these last again, we think of this very perception as a peculiar kind of accident, and in virtue of this we call it time.
Okay, Martin, thank you for reading that for us today. It looks like today's episode is going to be a continuation from last week in a discussion of this issue of properties and qualities of atoms. The subject matter breaks down pretty neatly into what we've read today concerns that issue of properties and qualities. And then in line 72, we shift over to time. And that's also an extremely deep subject. So let's try to do the best we can to not only compare these observations with modern physics, but also to try to get an idea, and mainly get an idea of where Epicurus was going and how he saw his explanations as helpful to living daily life. Okay, and so starting back into the properties and qualities issues again. And today I would like to be sure to compare. This is really a good section to compare other translations on. I've got the Loeb edition, which is the Hicks translation, in front of me today as well. It's also, I think, extremely helpful to compare the corresponding section of Lucretius where this property and quality issue is being discussed. And we've got in the show notes the particular references to that part in book 1. And so maybe before we start on the very first line of the text today, let me read a section that I think is around the same area here. The Hicks version, which reads significantly differently, but actually may be more clear. Here's what Hicks has to say, I think, about line 70. He says, again, qualities often attach to bodies without being permanent concomitants. They are not to be classed among invisible entities, nor are they incorporeal. Hence, using the term accidents in the common sense, we can say plainly that accidents have not the nature of the whole thing to which they belong, and to which, conceiving it as a whole, we give the name of the body, nor that of the permanent properties without which body cannot be thought of. Now, in the Hicks edition in Loeb, he has a footnote, and when he first uses this term accidents, he says, compare Lucretius Book 1, lines 445, and he says, where slavery, poverty, riches, war, and peace are the examples chosen, as elsewhere are rest and motion. That is what he's describing as these qualities which are changing. So with that, let's go back to the opening of the section. All these properties have their own peculiar means of being perceived and distinguished, provided always that the aggregate body goes along with them and is never wrested from them, but in virtue of its comprehension as an aggregate of qualities, acquires the predicate of body. You know, whenever you start talking to somebody new in philosophy about what reality means and how we perceive it, what's one of the first things you're going to get thrown at you in conversations today is that I don't know whether I'm a brain in a vat attached to electrodes being stimulated by some outside mad scientist. I don't know that anything is real. And I think that this discussion of properties and qualities in Epicurus is something that doesn't attach to that exact example, but I do think that that's kind of where he's going, is that he's telling us what parts of the things we can perceive we should consider to be real or not. And probably if we had a good understanding of where he's going here with properties and qualities, we'd be a lot better equipped to deal with those examples of, well, how do you know that anything is real? Joshua, what are you thinking right now?
I guess what I'm thinking is that this is all very difficult to get a hold of, isn't it?
It is.
And I guess what most of it seems to hinge on is this issue of permanence, in which you've got the properties themselves, which are permanently accompany the body, and then the accidents and or qualities which don't permanently accompany the body. That's, I guess, is the best I could do at the moment.
Yeah, this is a good point for me to go back into the Lucretius section that applies here. And it's confusing because we're talking at two levels, one level about atoms and one level about the bodies that are composed of atoms. And in Lucretius, again, around line 430 or so, or 449, there's this discussion that we talked about last week a little bit. But he says, therefore, besides what's body or space, no third degree of nature can be found. Nothing that can ever affect our sense or by the power of thought can be conceived. And then he says this, all other things you'll find essential conjuncts, or else the events or accidents of these. I call essential conjunct what's so joined to a thing that it cannot without fatal violence be forced or parted from it. And before I give you the examples, I mean, I think that at that point, it's clear he's talking about bodies, because you can't break up an atom. So you're not going to be ever able to break off anything from an atom under this theory of Epicurean physics. So what he's now talking about when he's talking about essential conjuncts or events or accidents is something in the realm of bodies. And so his examples are the things that cannot be broken away is weight to stones, fire, heat, moisture to the sea, touched to bodies and what is not to be touched to the void. And of course, void is not really a body, but stones and fire and the sea, those are bodies, those are accumulations of atoms. And he's saying that from certain accumulations of atoms, you can't break off without destroying the body certain things. And those things he calls, I think, properties or maybe essential conjuncts. And then the next sentence says, but on the contrary, bondage, liberty, riches, poverty, war, concord, or the like, which will not affect the nature of the things, but come and go, with the thing remaining entire. These, as it is fit we call events, or I think the other word is accidents. So let's stay first in the dimension of bodies and things that we see around us and can touch and feel. It looks like he's saying that there are, in this world of ours, certain things that we can consider to be essential conjuncts or properties of a body. And a stone has weight to it. Fire has heat to it. The sea has moisture to it. And I know there may be some problems with some of those examples. He's saying that we should first take a category of things that have an essential nature to them and can't be changed. And those fit in one category, while the other category is very changeable. And you can have things like bondage, liberty, riches, poverty, war, concord. And you can have all those things affecting the same bodies, but those are transitory events in the lives of those bodies. You can remove capitalism from Joshua without destroying Joshua. You can remove socialism from Karl Marx without destroying Karl Marx, maybe. Those are examples of at least the person of them. You can change the color of a rock without destroying the essential nature of the rock. So therefore, it looks to me like he's setting up these two categories of things by which we should organize the things that are around us. Joshua, are you ready to comment further, or should we go to Martin?
Let me read a passage from Shakespeare here, if you don't mind. Antony
Go
and
ahead.
Cleopatra. Lepidus says, "What manner of thing is your crocodile?" And Mark Antony replies, "It is shaped, sir, like itself, and it is as broad as it hath breadth. It is just so high as it is, and it moves with its own organs. It lives by that which nourisheth it, and the elements once out of it, it transmigrates." And Lepidus says, "What color is it of?" And Antony says, "Of its own color too." Lepidus says, "'Tis a strange serpent." And Antony says, "'Tis so, and the tears of it are wet." And so the reason I thought of that, it's sort of, I mean, just stating the obvious, isn't it? But as I listen to you talk about some of what we're talking about today, I can't help but think of this, because really what we're talking about are, I hate to even use words at this point, but things that cannot be separated from other things without fundamentally destroying the thing.
Martin, stay with me on the level of perceptible things in our existence before we start talking about modern physics, because I know that you have some commentary about how we might modify some of these observations with modern physics. But where do you think Epicurus is going with this distinction between things that can change and things that cannot change?
I don't know.
That's why it's so difficult. But I do think it's something that he is thinking must be connected to how atomism translates into important things for our daily life. It's one thing to just make a theoretical statement that atoms and void exist and everything is made up of atoms. But unless that has some significance to us, I don't really think they would have included it at this level of importance in the philosophy. I mean, Lucretius, this is the main composition of the first book of what he wrote to Memmius, who, for all we know, didn't know a thing about atoms and void. And yet Lucretius was considering this kind of material to be extremely important. And I think we can pretty well determine from this letter to Herodotus and from the 12 fundamentals of nature that Epicurus thought this was extremely important too. I've used the word bridge or linkage. I think this is the linkage between the abstract theory of atoms and void and how we can apply it in everyday life. It's not just the elimination of supernatural gods and the elimination of life after death because of the nature of atoms, but you do have these, Book 4 is full of examples of illusions. And it's obvious that in Epicurean philosophy, the senses are key in unwinding everything and leading us to the conclusions that we lead to. So I guess you have to have a theory of how the senses can be trusted, in which we have to understand that even though the atoms themselves are eternal and don't change, the things that we do see around us do change in many ways, not in every way, but in many ways. And unless you have an understanding of what things can change and what things can't change, then you really haven't gathered as much as you can from the original theory of atoms and void in the first place. And again, I think, Martin, you raised this last week. This is still in the category of refuting the issue of Platonic ideal forms that are eternal and exist forever. He's telling us that what makes up yellow is not something that's eternal form or an essence of yellow. He's saying that it arises from the quality of particular atoms under particular circumstances. So that when, according to the most general usage, we employ this name, we make it clear that accidents have neither the nature of the whole, which we comprehend in its aggregate and call body, nor that of the qualities which permanently accompany it, without which a given body cannot be conceived. I guess we've discussed that, and it's basically the point that an event, an accident, is a quality, does not have the same nature as the whole. A banana is not yellow, yellow is not a banana, and that we have to keep those attributes distinguished. And 71, and we must not banish this clear vision from the realm of existence, because it does not possess the nature of the whole to which it is joined, nor that of the permanent accompaniments. Nor must we suppose that the contingencies exist independently, for that's inconceivable. But just as it appears in sensation, we must think of them as events occurring to bodies, and not as permanent accompaniments, or again, as having themselves in a place of the ranks of material existence. Rather, they are seen to be just what our actual sensation shows their proper character to be. To me, we're getting closer to the example of the mad scientist and the brain in the vat, because he's saying, even though yellow does not exist as a Platonic form or as an existence, we must not banish this clear vision from the realm of existence. Rather, they are to be seen just what our actual sensation shows their proper character to be. To me, I think what he's telling us is that the things that we observe, we should consider them to exist. We should not banish these clear visions from the realm of existence. Rather, they're seen to be just what our actual sensation shows their proper character to be. That's kind of getting closer to a statement of all sensations are true in a certain sense, that we should accept what the sensation tells us, even though we might need to check it by additional sensations at other times. Somebody give me some help here.
So I keep seeing the word quality used in different ways, and I'm just now starting to maybe understand the Venn diagram here, which is that everything in the circle is a quality. The properties are qualities, the accidents or eventum, those are qualities. Do I have that right?
I
If you
think
go
so.
ahead, Martin.
I understand the same. Yes.
I think so too. Start over
Okay.
though. What's the big circle? The biggest circle is what? Everything's a
Would
quality.
be the qualities, yeah. Well, not everything's a quality. There's the atoms themselves that exist in nature, but all of these other attributes, whether they're permanent or not, if they're permanent, we think of them as properties. If they are temporary, we might think of them as accidents or events. But in any case, all of that can be described as qualities.
So if you're doing a Venn diagram, let's talk about that. We can probably picture it and actually come up with a Venn diagram for the notes to the episode. But if you're doing a Venn diagram, is those circles and those intersecting circles that people see a lot of. So how many circles are we dealing with? 2?
3. Huh?
Well, the way I'm now thinking of it is you've got the one big circle with nothing really intersecting it, and that's qualities. And then within qualities, you've got 2 smaller circles. One of them is properties, one of them is accidents or events.
I don't know about that. because you're saying that the big circle, if you're going to label that as quality, what is the meaning of quality in that sense? Because that's the question we were talking about even before we started recording the episode. Do all qualities have to be perceptible to the senses? Is there an example of a quality of something that is not perceptible to the senses? And let's stay again for the time being in Epicurean terms. When Epicurus refers to a quality, does he ever seem to be referring to something that's not perceptible to the senses?
I just don't know that question.
Or does a quality always change? Is a quality something that always changes? Maybe that's really my bigger concern about one big circle. Go ahead.
The thing is, he includes properties as a quality.
Can you give me an example of that?
As we've been going through the text here, I keep having to rethink what I'm thinking because I keep seeing new sentences. He says here, nor that of the qualities which permanently accompany it, without which a given body cannot be conceived. That's in 70. And then somewhere further down, there was something about.
Yeah, I see what you're saying in 70, which we comprehend in its aggregate and call body, nor that of the qualities which permanently accompany it, without which a given body cannot be conceived. That's this issue that takes us back and forth between the level of the perceptible and the level of the imperceptible. Are we talking about a body? Are we talking about an atom? Are we talking about both?
Well, I'm more concerned about this permanently accompany it part.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when we say permanently accompany it, what is it?
I guess the body. I don't know.
Yeah, because of course the problem there with a body is if a body is an accumulation of atoms, I think we've got a prior definition somewhere in Epicurean physics that bodies don't have permanence to them, right? Bodies come together and eventually going to split apart. And that's one of the sort of general rules of Epicurean physics. So
yeah. When I think permanently here just means for as long as it exists. Right?
Yes, I agree.
Like you can't, you can't take heat from fire. Fire will always be hot in any of its manifestations. That doesn't mean that fire is permanent.
Right. I think that's a great and a very important point.
So back to the question we asked last week, at what point does this just become all about wordplay?
Well, yeah, I think if I were trying to come to a summary of it, let's go back to, I won't challenge you again with does God exist, but let's talk about yellow and whether yellow exists or not and what yellow is in this framework. What is yellow in this framework of atoms and void and qualities and properties and bodies? What is yellow? Does yellow have a body?
No.
Is yellow a body?
Yellow is just the appearance of a body under the right conditions.
Okay, I think that's right. And which would be the same for these other things that he's listed, such as in Lucretius, such as riches, slavery, poverty, capitalism, communism, which he did not list. But those also, they're not bodies. They are accompaniments of bodies under particular circumstances. So the issue with yellow is, after we try to absorb all this in 69, 70, and 71, is that yellow is our best word seems to be quality rather than event or accident, but yellow is a quality of a particular body under particular circumstances. Everybody agree with that? That's simple enough or clear enough, right? Yellow is a quality of a certain body under particular circumstances.
That's true, according to my understanding, but it's not as specific as you can be.
Okay, keep going.
Because I don't think that yellow is a property. And if it is a quality, but it's not a property, then must it be therefore an accident or an event?
Well, yellow doesn't permanently accompany anything at all, right? And when I say permanently, for the life of its being, yellow doesn't permanently accompany anything, which would be required in order to be considered a essential conjunct or a
I think this is not always applicable. If we deal with pure compounds, as chemical compounds, pure of them, they may have a color which they always have. So that means if it has this compound, it has this color.
I am never going to be able to challenge anything you say on physics or science basis, Martin. I just would have to question whether that's the case. I mean, even under any circumstances, wouldn't you always be viewing anything with a certain type of light And wouldn't the quality of the light that you're using to view anything largely control the color it has to us? The color we perceive, anyway.
Okay, it would modify this one in some sense as we see it with the eyes. On the other hand, we meanwhile standardized color measurement, and these measurements are extensions of our senses. So, and we can compare with this with with a color chart. So that means now we have, because we standardize the conditions, then this becomes something like a permanent property of different types of pure compounds, what color they have. No? So they, under the standard conditions, they always have this one color. So it becomes something permanent, no? Whereas what we just see under varying circumstances, that is again more like an accident.
Okay, well, when I hear you conclude that sentence by saying what we see under normal circumstances, I guess that's the level at which we're supposed to be talking about philosophically here in terms of our own reality, not necessarily as a physics description, but as far as the way we live and die in an everyday life. When we talk about yellow, we're generally not talking about something that has a permanent existence to it. There is no Platonic absolute yellow in another dimension, and there is no essence of yellow that accompanies everything that is yellow. There is just the contextual way that we observe things under certain conditions. I'm not really intending to disagree with what you just said, Martin. I think that there's several levels of or perspectives at looking at it.
Yeah, another example, which is more for daily life. If you go to the shop for supplies for home improvement, you can buy paint. No? So this paint has defined colors, and if you paint it on it, it will have a pretty much a defined color tone. Of course, if you choose different background, different illumination, it may vary a bit, but largely if you buy a pot with yellow paint and paint it on it, that thing will look yellow.
Right. I think the example is used in Lucretius of the senators sitting under the awnings at the Forum or the Colosseum or whatever, where the color of, where if it's a red awning, the senators will appear to be reddish because of the light that gets to them through the red awning. So there's color is a very useful example to talk about in this issue of qualities versus properties, because the senators may look to be red while they're sitting in the Colosseum under the awning, or their tunics, if they're white, may appear to be reddish, but their tunics will lose that reddish color when they come out from underneath the awning and they are seen in a different type of light. And maybe where we're going with all this is what's described in Book 4 is just, again, this issue of validating the senses and showing that, you know, you got to deal with these issues of the fact that the senator's tunic looks to be a different color under certain circumstances. Is there some mystical reason for that, or is there an atomic physics, non-supernatural method of explaining it? And maybe at a very fundamental level, we could say that what we're discussing now is the explanation for how things can look different under different circumstances without there being a God playing tricks on us, or without there being a mad scientist changing the settings on his electrodes on the mind in our vat, that we have the ability to explore these things and determine a non-supernatural example for it. Maybe this would be a moment to move on to discussing time and come back to the whole issue when we finish the episode today. Anybody have anything else on properties and qualities before we change to the much easier topic of time? Joshua, anything else you wanted to say at the moment?
No, not really, no.
Okay. I think that probably time is an example of another. Let's talk about this. Is time an example of a quality? Is that what he's saying in 72 and 73 here when he says, moreover, you must firmly grasp this point as well. We must not look for time as we do for all other things which we look for in an object by referring them to general conceptions, but we must take the direct intuition in accord which we speak of a long time or a short time and examine it and apply our intuition to time as we do to other things. Neither must we search for expressions as likely to be better, but employ just those which are in common use about it. Now, here's one way of looking at that. Is Epicurus telling us that we don't need to measure time by a clock? We can just say that our next episode of this podcast will be a long time away. or a short time away. Is that good enough? Is that what he's saying? What is he saying there? And who are
I
these
think it's
people who
difficult.
are giving expressions that are better? Go ahead.
I think it's difficult to say what exactly he's saying here. He seems to think that, of course, time is not something that you can observe, but the way that we approach time is by intuition, is by just noticing the passing of time. I don't know.
Not really. He also refers exactly to measurement. No? So it is with days and nights and the divisions that we associate it. That means he refers to fairly accurate measurement of time. So it's not only by our intuition that we feel something has passed quickly or took a long time, but there is something like what he provides as a, it's not in some sense really absolute, but it's something what is measured in some way objectively.
Gosh, this is a really deep subject that if we were experts, we'd have an awful lot more to say on. There were people out there who suggested that time was a separate existence, that going further even than just talking about father time or considering time to be a force, they considered that time actually was, maybe force is the right word, that they considered time to have existence of its own, or attributes of its own, or properties of its own. And to some extent, relating it in this context, he seems to me to be, just like yellow. As Martin's been saying, you can do all sorts of things to measure color and come to all sorts of what we would consider to be scientific divisions of color and its shades and intensities and so forth. And certainly we can do the same thing with time. But in all of our methods of calculating and measuring and dividing time up into components, we're still not dealing with anything that exists in a Platonic dimension or anything that exists as an essence within everything. We're dealing with a quality, at least in certain senses. Martin, I've always wanted to be able to move through time and manipulate time, and maybe this is a good time to talk about modern physics for just a minute. What is the best modern way of looking at time? Does it have any existence of its own, or is it just the result of moving things around from place to place?
It's like we like any other quantity used in physics. There is a definition and how to measure it, and how to create a unit for it. No? So, and in that way, it is at this very basic level, it is not different from other quantities in physics. And then if we, one thing where it is maybe different from a lot of things is that it's not something like the quality like color. It's something different. No? So it sticks in some way. It does stick out in some way there from those quantities which are actually associated with particular bodies. No? But in order to measure time, you still do need markers, so bodies and markers in space, for example, that you can measure it. You know? So and this one relates then to with movements and states of rest. So intuitionally, I think Epicurus had a good grasp about time. No? So that what we need to measure it is some sort of movement and possibly also states of rest as markers. So that is where time is relevant.
Yes, that's where in the Loeb edition of Diogenes Laertius, it's actually on page 600, if that makes any difference to anybody. In this description of the term accidents, Hicks says of Lucretius, Book 1, 445, where slavery, poverty, riches, war, and peace are the examples chosen, as elsewhere are rest and motion. It's tempting to say that when you talk about bodies and atoms, that there's a real thing that can be touched. We can't touch an atom ourselves, but atoms eventually are touchable by bodies. Does time have any capacity in which it can be touched?
Yeah, I mean, with the extension of our senses by creating instruments to measure time, in that sense, we can, so to say, touch it.
I don't know about so to say, it might be pretty strong there. Joshua?
You,
Oh,
you,
go
you,
ahead,
create,
Martin.
you can create a type of clock where you can measure time, read out the time by touch. Maybe for the blind, they have that type of clock. No? So, I mean, more common now, they will probably use acoustic signal, but you could design a clock where you can feel the shape, and that will tell you the time.
You can walk outside and feel the state of the sun and determine where it is over your head and measure time that way too, to some extent.
I was going to say the Greeks had a way of measuring time. They used something called a clepsydra, which comes from two words meaning the klept and the hydro, meaning water. And so it actually means the water stealer. And it had to do with measuring the amount of time it took for a quantity of water to flow from one vessel into another. And this is how they would use it at legal trials, for example, to make sure that the defense and the prosecution got the same amount of time to argue their case, that kind of thing. And I guess this was the most accurate way to measure time until you first get to clockmaking in England in something like the 17th century. But they're actually the basic design. You can find them in antiquity all over the world. I mean, India, China, Egypt. It's the same basic idea, but it's was hit upon by most ancient civilizations.
Joshua, does that strike you, using a clock to measure time, does that strike you as different in any way, or basically the same thing as using an instrument to measure a shade of yellow?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Certainly in the case of the water clock, there are things that you could do to sort of speed up the flow, right? For example, you could put the water under pressure, and does that mean that time is moving more quickly?
If I had the right reference here, what I would try to relate your comments to would be, it seems to me that just like we've been talking recently about the main quality or attribute of the void is that it gives space for atoms within which to move. It seems like I've read in numerous places things about atoms where their major quality or major attribute is that they have the ability to touch or be touched or act or be acted upon. Some lines like that I think maybe is more in Lucretius. It's probably here in Herodotus somewhere here too. But I just have this impression that when he's talking about, or let's relate time to atoms, maybe that's where I'm going. I'm just concerned that an atom, you can supposedly act on an atom. Even today under modern physics, I presume you can push atoms around. But I think even under the Epicurean view, even though you can't touch it or see it, atoms themselves touch and can be touched by other atoms. But is there such a thing called time which can touch or be touched? And I'll stop the question there. Is there such a thing as time that can touch or be touched? Because how ultimately do you relate time to atoms? They're not a component of atoms, and I'm not even sure it's accurate to call them an attribute of atoms. And maybe that's why he's telling us not to struggle with all sorts of things that we're struggling with here in terms of being more precise. But at least for our perspective today, what is the connection between atoms and time?
Yeah, the atoms move in time. No? So that means the movements of the atoms is follows the flow of time.
I think that's the right direction, Martin. Of course, the atoms themselves don't have any knowledge of anything, but I'm trying to distinguish between whether yellow strikes me as something that's just, like you say, it's totally subjective, or I'm not sure anybody said it's totally subjective, but yellow is easier to see as something subjective about the way we perceive it under certain conditions. But time, it seems to have more to it than just the way we perceive it. I mean, the state of the situation on the moon right now, the state of the moon, if you were walking on the moon right now, the state of the rocks and the dust and so forth on the moon right now are different than they would be if you went on another day to your trip to the moon. But you're not adding anything to the dust and the dirt on the moon from day to day that's called time. In connection with these last again, we think of this very perception as a peculiar kind of accident or peculiar kind of event. And in virtue of this, we call it time. Was there a Greek god of time? What's this Horus? Horus, or was that a Greek god of?
Kronos was the god of time.
Kronos, yes. You know anything about Kronos, Joshua?
He ate his children.
He ate his children.
And he was the father of Zeus. And somehow Zeus was not eaten. He was set aside, went to be raised by some peasant family. And then when he came of age, his mother told him who he really was. And he killed Kronos. He did something to get his brothers and sisters out of Kronos' stomach. Horus, however, that was a Egyptian god.
So what are we supposed to think of time? I don't know that we get a lot more in Herodotus after 73 on time. I think he changes the subject and he goes to one of my favorite subjects, which is the issue of life on other worlds. So we don't get anything more on time than this. So what are we supposed to take away from this? I mean, at the end of 73 here, Bailey says a peculiar kind of accident. And Hicks says, no further proof is required. We've only to reflect that we attach the attribute of time to days and nights and their parts, and likewise to feelings of pleasure and pain, and to neutral states, to states of movement and states of rest, conceiving a peculiar accident of these to be this very characteristic which we express by the word time. And there's apparently a scholium that says he says this both in the second book on nature and in the larger epitome.
I just have nothing to say. I don't know. Isn't it the case, Martin? You might know more about this than I do, but when you travel at extremely high speeds, you experience time differently?
Yes. So time is no more absolute. In Newtonian mechanics, time was absolute, but now since the inception of the theory of relativity, we know that time is dependent on the circumstances, like the speed of bodies. No? So by comparing two different bodies with different speeds, we see that for each of them, the time, when for one object, the time has passed, a certain amount of time has passed. For the other object, that time is different, the time difference.
I don't know about Newtonian physics, but that sounds to me like something we could relate to what Epicurus is saying here, that we perceive it differently.
Yeah, so this is quite interesting. So at no point Epicurus indicates the existence of an absolute time. So his physics, as contradictory it might be in other aspects, it is open to the theory of relativity. I wouldn't say it anticipated theory of relativity, but it's compatible with it.
Yeah, I guess that comes out as a result of him rejecting time being an absolute, just like he's rejecting everything being absolute in Platonic and Aristotelian terms, other than the properties of the atoms themselves. But what I struggle with in the back of my mind, time seems to be something that has more of an existence to it. It's easy for me to perceive yellow or color as being just something that's obviously transitory and obviously a factor of the observer and how the observer's eyes are working and what kind of light is out there. And I can more easily consider yellow to be something that I, as the observer, are contributing to the equation. But I have a hard time considering time to be in the same way, that I'm not contributing. The day that I choose to fly to the moon doesn't contribute anything to where the rocks are going to be located on a particular day when I get to the moon. But I guess yellow is also independent of me too. I'm not the only person who observes yellow. Under the same condition, any other number of people could look at the same banana and consider it to be yellow. So it's not like each individual person is investing the banana with yellow every time he looks at it. It does have a continuing appearance to it. But maybe in the end they're similar, not because we invest the banana with yellow, but because under the same circumstances, any number of people at any time could perceive the banana as yellow. So a banana is yellow today, and the banana will probably be yellow tomorrow and probably was yellow yesterday for anybody who's a human being who looks at it under normal circumstances.
Yeah, that is now again an example which doesn't really fit, because when they grow, they are first green, then they become yellow, and they brownish black. So they do change their color.
Right.
So the yellow is associated with a certain state of ripeness.
Right. Maybe this is also wrapped into the material in Lucretius about considering the Trojan War and how the Trojan War was an accident or event of the people who lived at that particular time. Maybe there's no coincidence that he's talking about an ancient event that happened a long time ago, because he could have just been talking about a war that was going on in another country at the same time he was writing. Maybe he's making a point in referring to the Trojan War as well, that the difference in time between him and the hundreds of years at least that had passed since the Trojan War were important to the illustration. So maybe the ultimate point is just that there's no absolute nature of time, and we can just comfort ourselves that we continue to separate ourselves from Aristotle and Plato and say that there's no Platonic realm of ideal forms and that there are no eternal essences according to Aristotle, and that Epicurus is just using example after example to point out to us that the only thing that has a permanent, eternal, unchanging nature are the atoms. And so we should get ready for change every day. We should get ready for change in our lives, for people to be born, for us to die. And we should get used to the idea that there's no permanence anywhere, such as some people would speculate exists beyond the golden gates of Michael. Who stands guard at the gates of heaven? Is it Michael, the archangel Michael, or somebody else?
It's St. Peter.
Well, we can begin to wrap up. But Martin, I don't want to have cut short any commentary that you want to make about something that modern physics might have here, but what's going through your mind right now in terms of application, especially of this material? Does this kind of analysis, these kind of perspectives, does it give us any assistance in dealing with the question of whether Joshua is a figment of our imagination and we are brains in a vat being manipulated by a mad scientist? Is a potential application of this to say that it doesn't matter to us if that's the case, because whatever we ultimately perceive in the world of our existence is what's important to us? I don't think I want to draw that conclusion quite yet, but he's clearly telling us, and we must not banish this clear vision from the realm of existence because it does not possess the nature of the whole, nor does it exist independently. We must think of it as an event, not a permanent accompaniment, and see them as to be just what our actual sensation shows their proper character to be. Does that lead into just ultimately, if in fact the mad scientist has enough power to make us think this from birth to death, then we should just not concern ourselves with it. Ultimately, what we need to do is live our lives according to the level of sensation and the abilities that nature gave us. I think ultimately every resolution of the mad scientist problem comes down to the issue of it's just not possible, at least within our level of science, to think that that kind of thing is possible.
And I'm also just unpersuaded by it, so I don't have to spend a whole lot of time thinking about it or coming up with.
Why are you unpersuaded by
it? I don't know. It's not something I take seriously. See, the idea is people have that they have good reasons for thinking what they think. I don't think I have good reason for not being persuaded by it. Mm-hmm. Other than I just don't find it persuasive.
It could be that that's related to these sentences here about time as well, that we must not look for time as we do for all other things which we look for in an object by referring them to the general conceptions which we perceive in our minds, but we must take the direct intuition in accordance with which we speak of a long time or a short time and examine it applying our intuition to time as we do to other things. I think you're on the right track there, Joshua, is that everything you believe there, it just intuitively seems correct that you should have to have a reason for it. You should have to have evidence for it. You just don't accept your imagination, which we've been talking about in a few days in Athens. You just don't let your imagination run wild without being able to tie it to evidence through the senses. And there just doesn't seem to be evidence other than a logic word game for the mad scientist example. Well, this has been a difficult subject today, and we're probably at a point where we ought to wrap up this episode. So let's think about what final commentary to wrap this episode up on properties and qualities of atoms and bodies, and on the issue of time. Shall we go to Martin first?
Yeah, it's most of the time I have nothing to add.
Okay, if you think of something as we close, just say so. But Joshua, I'm really impressed with the Lepidus quote from Mark Antony. That I would never have come up in a million years.
Yeah, very good. Other than that, no, I don't have any major closing thoughts. Other than to say, if people are listening to this and they're hopelessly confused about accidents and qualities and properties and time, I guess what I would say to those people is, it's quite possible to get through life without really having to think too much about these things. It's probably not the ending that you want me to come up with, but.
Well, I think a lot of people will be fine with that conclusion. I do think, though, that for the philosophy heavyweights among us and for those who in the future will push forward in greater understanding and articulation of Epicurean principles, that there's a lot more here than we've been able to dig out so far. I would suggest people compare this to what's in Book 4 about illusions, and to the conclusion in Book 4, which is ultimately why you trust the senses, because you can validate them. And absent through the senses, you don't have any means of validating anything. The whole issue of knowledge and whether you can ever know anything with confidence or whether everything is just totally uncertain. I think you unwind those issues by going back to these questions of properties and qualities, so that you can explain why some things appear to be permanent to some degree and why other things aren't permanent, but then why ultimately, as we were talking earlier in the episode, the word permanent in our terms doesn't mean mystically permanent and eternal in the same way that we get hit every day from Judeo-Christian theology, that ultimately in the natural universe, nothing has any eternal permanence and therefore is entitled to be looked at as a mystical, supernatural thing which we should worship, that nothing has permanent, eternal qualities except the atoms and the void. And I think this plays in articulating that argument. But I think the position we're in today in the episode and Epicurean Friends, we're hopefully helping future people do better research and better articulation than we can. I think that's the direction it goes, though. So, okay. Anything else?
Nope. I don't have anything else.
Okay, very good. All right, well, we'll come back next week and continue on with Herodotus and these episodes 122 and 123. I think we'll have some significant notes in the forum for people to follow up and read some more about it. So with that, thanks for your time, and we'll be back next week. Bye.
Thanks.
Sounds good.
Okay, bye.